Hello, welcome back. This is Dr. Pasion-Gonzales, and this week is Chapter 13, Theories of Personality. As always, there's lots of material to cover in this chapter. There are theorists and concepts that you need to be aware of course, but today's lecture video is going to primarily focus on Sigmund Freud and Carl Rogers, since they are real icons in the field. For the test, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on the personality assessment section, so I wouldn't sweat that too much in terms of preparing for the test. I think you should be familiar with Bandura's learning theory in 13.6 and also Rotter's locus of control in table 13.3. I think that's just good stuff to know. In section 1310, be familiar with Allport and also Cattell's 16PF. Also, be familiar with the terms surface traits versus source traits. And in section 1311, review the five-factor model of personality in table 13.4. So, starting with Freud. First of all, be sure that you don't get confused with the difference between the structures of the mind, which are the preconscious, the conscious, and the unconscious, versus the division of personality that he described, which is the id, the ego, and the superego. There's a figure in 13.2. One of Freud's enduring contributions to the field of psychology is the idea of the unconscious mind that is hidden from our awareness but contributes dramatically to what we do and how we think. For Freud, the unconscious mind gets expressed symbolically, for example, through dreams and in how we interact with people, even though we might not be consciously aware of why. These days, we know that much of what our brain does is underneath our conscious awareness, so we take these things for granted. But it was revolutionary at the time. We know now that most of what our brain actually does is below our conscious awareness. So, the id. Freud thought of the id as the unconscious, pleasure-seeking part of us that contains all of the biological drives, such as hunger and thirst, self-preservation, and sex. And I think it is interesting to think about the id and how similar in some ways this is to the amygdala, a powerful yet primal force within our brain. However, since we can't just go around having sex with everyone we want, whether or not they agree, and we can't kill everyone who gets in the way of us having what we want, we develop an ego, or an executive director, to help the id meet its primary needs without getting into trouble. Freud called this the reality principle. And the book describes the reality principle as, if it feels good, do it, but only if you can get away with it. Okay? The id actually needs the ego to meet its needs effectively, since the ego is smart and more cunning than the id. So the ego is the part of our brain that is conscious, logical, and rational. This should sound familiar. We talked about this same kind of relationship between the prefrontal cortex, the professor, and the amygdala, the chimp. We know from the research what Freud theorized over 100 years ago. Remember that at that time, when Freud was developing his theories, he did very little actual experimentation at all. All of his theories came out of the clinical work he did with the Victorian upper-class patients he saw as a psychiatrist, mostly women. Even though his ideas are considered outdated in many ways, we still can't deny his continued impact in the world of psychology, especially therapy. The third component of personality, according to Freud, was the superego. He considered this to be the moral center or conscience for our mind. The book refers to the superego as the moral watchdog. For him, this is where we feel guilt, shame, and what he called moral anxiety when we do the wrong thing. We have a moral compass that tries to keep us on track. Freud argued that we do not have a sense of right or wrong until we develop this conscience. So keep in mind, Freud was talking about a conceptual model for understanding our mind. So he wasn't really talking about physical brain structures like the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex. In Table 13.1, review the defense mechanisms. We'll talk about one or two of them today. And at least review the 5 psychosexual stages of personality in Table 13.2. I think his defense mechanisms are still relevant today, and you will find people who still refer to them not just clinically, but just in everyday life. Keep in mind that the purpose of the defense mechanisms are to deal with emotional pain or anxiety by distorting reality in some predictable ways. Remember when we reviewed the cognitive model, the A plus B equals C, where B is the beliefs about what just happened to us? So these defense mechanisms are really occurring at that same level. Defense mechanisms are trying to resolve conflicts and cognitive dissonance by changing the B part of that equation, our beliefs and our perceptions about the situation. I always think it's interesting that concepts we talk about in one chapter, in one area of psychology, parallels or seems really, really similar to themes in other areas of psychology. All right, let's just talk about the first two defense mechanisms, denial and repression. But again, I really want you to look through all of those defense mechanisms in Table 13.1 and be familiar with them. So, denial is different from repression. Denial is refusing to acknowledge a painful or threatening situation. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. It can't be true. While repression is pushing the situation out of conscious memory. So you don't even allow yourself to remember what happened because it was so painful and so awful. All right. As you review the different defense mechanisms in Table 13.1, you can credit Freud for giving these common human responses a name and a context. So, in other words, I think it's really interesting that we all do these things. Now we just have a name for it. Now, there are psychosocial developmental stages that Freud talked about, and I want you to be familiar with these stages, but I'm really not going to focus much on them. Freud's developmental theory is a little different from some of the other theorists like Piaget and Erikson and Vygotsky in that he was focused more on how we develop a personality style and how we deal with emotional issues that we get stuck on. We see some of that with Erikson, right? And actually, Erikson came out of this psychodynamic school of thought. Another big theorist in this school of thought is Carl Jung, Jung. And he's interesting to read, and especially some of his thoughts on the collective unconscious, the idea that human beings share themes or what he called archetypes that show up in stories and folklore and cultures all over the world. There are still a few graduate schools based on Carl Jung's thinking, but I'd say he's more interesting as a historical figure more than relevant these days. Next, let's talk about Carl Rogers and the humanistic perspective. Carl Rogers is interesting to me for a couple of different reasons. He took a very different approach to the human experience than Freud did, and some of his concepts are still very relevant and with us today. When I was reading through this chapter, I thought it was interesting that in some ways, this idea of an unconditional positive regard is the ultimate form of positive reinforcement, which we talked about in previous chapters. But also, it's kind of interesting because it's just the opposite of positive reinforcement in that for Carl Rogers, you didn't have to do anything to earn being treated well. You by the just by the mere fact that you were human, you deserve to be treated well. Now, in therapy, the research suggests that the connection a therapist can make with a patient or client is the single best predictor for therapeutic outcomes than any other factor we have measured. So, Carl Rogers really is at the center of good therapy, no matter what theoretical approach one takes. In a couple of weeks, when we go over all of the different types of therapies there are, all the different ways to do therapy, what matters most is how well the therapist can make a connection with the person that they're working with. So essentially, Carl Rogers focused on treating people really well even before it was fashionable. Also, I think there's a lot to take from his work, not just in therapy, but in life. Imagine that you had somebody in your life that no matter what you did or what you said, they treated you as if you were valuable, as if you were important, at all times, with no strings attached. That was his basic approach to therapy. He trusted people to be self sufficient and have insights to help themselves out. So he didn't feel like he had to have all of the answers for you if you were going to see him as a therapist. Now, if you had somebody like that in your life, wouldn't you gravitate toward that person? Think about how much of your day or your thoughts are related to trying to please other people or prove your worth as a person. Even think about your discussion boards or test scores. They can often feel like not just a test of your knowledge of the material, but they begin to feel like they're testing your character or your abilities, right? So if you felt like you were fundamentally loved and your worth and your ability and your status was never in question, you might feel free to pursue the things that matter to you most. You might approach school as a stepping stone to you being the best version of you. You might read a textbook, not just to pass the test or to do well in the class, but for the pure joy of learning something relevant to your life. Think about how different that would be for most of us, and how we approach school or work or even exercise, our hobbies, or relationships. Would you take these activities more or less seriously? Would you put in more or less effort? Rogers talked about becoming a fully functioning person, someone who is in touch with their own feelings and abilities and are able to trust their innermost urges and intuitions. Now, he argued that to be a fully functioning person, we need unconditional positive regard. Now, you can argue over the word need, unconditional positive regard, but I think it is fair to say that at the very least, having unconditional positive regard surely helps. So, find people who will love and respect you unconditionally. And more important, show that unconditional positive regard to others. So, while Freud was focused more on the unconscious forces that shape our behavior and interactions with others, Rogers had a lot more faith in the inherent goodness and worth of the human being. He trusted people to know what was good for them, to make good decisions, and to act in altruistic ways. He and Maslow both believed that humans innately strive to be better, to want to reach their human potential. They called this self-actualizing tendency. So those are some of my thoughts about Sigmund Freud and Carl Rogers. They're very different people. They come from very different times, but their contributions are very significant. As always, take the Revel quizzes throughout the chapter. And at the end of the chapter in Revel, there's also a chapter quiz. Take that. Separate from that is the Canvas exam. And of course, you've got a discussion board. My office hours are Tuesday nights at 7 o'clock on Zoom. And in the announcements is the link for that. If you have any questions, email me, get a hold of me, and we'll work out whatever we need to. If you look at the announcements, there are 2 extra credit opportunities. The latest one is actually going to be a survey. I would like some feedback from you in terms of what's working for you, what's not working, any changes that I can make to the class for next semester. And so that's going to be worth 50 points. So if you need some extra credit, that's there for you. And the feedback is going to be very valuable for me. So even if you don't need the extra credit, I would just appreciate your feedback. Stay focused, get your work done early. If you have any questions or problems, reach out to me. Okay? All right. Work hard, enjoy, and I'll see you next week. Bye.